Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natnator, and welcome back to part 1-3 of the series titled On a Hill. This one's an action-packed episode, so I hope you're ready. Let's get right to it. So as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story continue. Then, another unusual phenomenon came to his attention. An inconsistency. Something which contradicted his own memory, his very faculties. The path behind was now different. While climbing, John had been amazed by how overgrown the hillside was compared to the track leading upward. This led him to suspect that it was perhaps used regularly. But on looking down the hill, it now appeared to be engulfed by the wandering hands of nature. Perhaps not completely, but certainly to a far degree greater than it had been before. The grass swept over it, while bushes and trees leaned in nearby, suggesting a more rugged terrain than he had initially noticed. Yet the path ahead lay clear. Looking to the world outside and down below, everything appeared distant somehow, almost synthetic in appearance. The colors were not as vivid. The meadows which populated the valleys had foregone their vibrancy, and the sky itself filtered down towards the ground with what John could only describe as false light. He struggled to dismiss the unwelcome feelings he was experiencing, and while he continued on for a time, as he climbed, the nausea from when he had first stepped foot onto the hillside returned. The cold sensation which had enveloped his extremities had progressed like a disease, penetrating his insides and chilling him to the bone. John had tried his best to reach the peak, but he was no fool. He knew that not a month passed without a report on the news about an inexperienced walker or climber going missing on a remote mountain, and while the hill was a seemingly more humble prospect, he was now willing to accept defeat, even welcoming it. The surroundings felt menacing, and his current physical condition was enough to cause retreat. Though he had not reached the summit, John decided that if he still made it back to the village after being on the hillside, that would be enough to dispute their superstitions. Perhaps he would return in the summer to evaluate the land, considering his decision to be a postponement rather than an admission of failure. Entertaining the notion that the locals may have been right all along was not something he wished to do. There would have to be evidence of his adventure, of course. Taking out of his pocket a camera phone, which he used to document his work, John began to shiver as once again an icy sensation crept up through his arms, provoking a desire to be warmed by the fire back at the inn. With a few artificial clicks, he photographed the surrounding hill. Then, as a joke, took a picture of himself forcing a smile, with a tangle of grass and trees as a backdrop. What he saw when he viewed the pictures sent chills through his body. The first photographs of the area turned out as expected, but the last betrayed something through the bushes behind him. What looked like a building of some description. At the forefront of John's mind, he was filled with an impulse to run, to leave that place. But he was fascinated by the idea of a hidden construction, removed from the outside world by a barrier of leaf, branch, and legend. Taking a deep breath, he crept quietly through the twisted grass, pulling the leaves of a large, low-hanging tree to the side. There, sitting on that hillside where locals feared to tread, lay what looked like an old chapel or church. One small steeple reached up toward the sky, with large stained-glass windows, many of which were broken, dotting the shell of the grey stone building, speaking of days more prominent and glad. John's heart raced at the sight of it. Perhaps this was the reason why the hill had been tarnished with superstition and myth. An old abandoned church was certainly a fertile foundation for frightening tales. Yet, the church itself did not banish his own feelings of caution. As he broke through a layer of leaves, grass, and climbing ivy, he could not help but respond to his nerves. Sweat began to drip down his face, while his heart pumped blood with an unsettling, unstable rhythm. Leaving the hill was still his intention, but as he drew closer to the stone archway which sheltered the church door within it, he surmised that the locals would probably be more open to his conventional explanation of why people feared the place, if they knew that he had been inside. Without seeing the interior of the church, the villagers could once again spin stories and falsehoods about what remained hidden. The door was a dark brown oak, with scratched, decorative metal black strips adorning its surface, but unfortunately, it seemed locked. John gave it a good few solid shoves with his hands, and then, surprisingly, with a groan of countless years, it creaked open slightly, creating a space just big enough for him to slide through. Peering in through the gap, he could see that the church floor was covered in fallen masonry from the roof above. A large collection of stones lay piled up behind the door. Their collective weight had held it shut, and although they had given way in part, they still provided enough resistance to stop it from opening completely. Cold, musty air escaped from inside, smelling stale and of stone long since abandoned. For a moment, John considered what he should do. Such an old building left to rot for decades, if not centuries, could prove dangerous. But the desire still burned deep within him to prove that he had bravely seen all that could be seen, that there were no ghosts or ghouls there, only fragments of a forgotten history. Taking out his phone, he poked his hand through the gap in the door and took a few photographs with the flash. The light lit up the entire hall inside, showing it to be filled with rubble from an obviously failing roof. But at the back of the room, there lay what appeared to be an altar of some kind. From his vantage point, it looked to be made of stone, resting on a raised step, several feet high. Above it, John was thrilled by the presence of an inscription of some kind carved into the back wall. But unfortunately, he could not decipher the lettering from the doorway. Sighing, he knew that the only way to read it would be to go inside. The concern of being injured or trapped by anything falling from above was paramount, but his curiosity was now in full flight, his enthusiasm quelling both the sickness in his stomach and the icy numbing of his extremities. After once more debating the risks, John decided that he would be as quiet as possible so as to reduce any risk of a cave-in. He just had to look. Taking a deep breath, he managed to squeeze through the opening, with a little effort, to the darkness inside. Using a small light on the back of his phone, he was now better situated to survey his surroundings in greater detail. The air was significantly colder, stinging the back of his throat as he inhaled, and though he had expected the interior to be cooler than the outside due to the volume of stone used in the building's construction, the church in reality felt more like a crypt than any place of worship. Stepping as carefully as he could, trying not to disturb or dislodge the large piles of rubble on the floor, John kept his eyes trained on the roof overhead, nervous that any loud noise might bring a piece of masonry down on top of him. The extent of the damage now became clear, with the occasional small shard of light penetrating the darkness from a few open, wound-like holes above. However, the hall remained surprisingly dim. John found this curious, as he felt that the interior around him should have been more visible somehow. It was as if the light was being absorbed by the darkened corners of the hall, but he immediately dismissed this notion as fanciful, and cited that his escalating imagination would be as good a reason as any to keep his nerves in check. Isolated and unknown environments could cloud even the most rational of minds. After climbing over 2 substantial piles of rubble, being careful to avoid several large, sharp pieces of broken wood jutting out from underneath, he finally found himself at the rear of the church hall. There lay the altar, a table carved from stone and smoothed by attentive and devoted hands. It was easy to imagine how frightening a priest from the Dark Ages would have seemed, poised up there, spouting fearsome tales from an unenlightened position, foaming at the mouth about damnation and demonic forces preying on the souls of the weak. A sense of elation and excitement filled John's mind. To be standing near to something with such a deep sense of history. Yet he considered warily the possibility that the altar had been quarried from that very hill, wrenched from a deposit of rock deep in the ground, born of processes far older than humanity itself. But the thrill of such an old and rare discovery quickly extinguished those thoughts. So enamored by the object was he, that he almost overlooked a small open doorway to the right of the altar, which appeared to lead down a flight of stairs to an underground chamber, possibly a vault or tomb. Shivering at the thought of what lay below, he knew that even with his level of skepticism, there would be no venturing down there. Superstition or not, wandering underneath the floor of a clearly decaying building was not a wise idea. Pointing his phone's narrow beam of white light to the rear of the hall, it cast a diminutive yet welcome glare over a series of dusty steps which led up to the altar's platform. A natural arrangement from which a priest or preacher would have delivered their service hundreds of years ago. but yet there felt little that was natural about it or its housing. Again, a creeping unease began to ruminate in his mind as he imagined a fervent and angered holy man standing above all, shouting cryptic and doom-laden parables of ancient origin at a huddled, confused, and frightened congregation. Making his way onto the platform, eager to study the inscription on the back wall more closely, his attention was unfortunately distracted from the cluttered ground as his foot clipped a broken rock lying on the last step. Stumbling forward abruptly, John's shoulder slammed painfully against the edge of the stone altar, before reaching out a hand to break his fall on the cold, hard platform floor. The noise of his fall echoed throughout the building, with the sound ricocheting from wall to roof. For a second, he imagined that he heard a fainter sound stirring from elsewhere, close, but far. Answering in kind, a small piece of debris plummeted from above, smashing to the ground, teasing and threatening a series of heavier and deadlier replies yet to come. Relief coursed through his body. Glad as he was that the object had not been more substantial in size, and even more so that the stone impacted in front of the small doorway, rather than against his head, he was becoming increasingly unsure of his safety. Regaining a solid footing, he stood up on the platform, holding his shoulder which was now battered and bruised, keeping his eyes trained to the roof nervously. All but for a gentle wind whistling through holes and gaps in the building's outer shell. Silence was omnipotent. Anxious that any other movements might bring the entire ceiling down on top of him, John waited for several minutes before assuming temporary safety from further falling masonry. Then, slowly and more carefully than before, he turned and appraised the altar more closely. Religious iconography dotted its sides along with strange, jagged symbols which he did not quite recognize. It was easy to imagine a communion of sorts being given from there, each member of the congregation somberly approaching, disheveled and malnourished, receiving a blessing from a stern priest who spoke more of wrath than of love. John would happily concede to anyone that he was not the most creative or imaginative in nature, but there in that forgotten place, he was surprised by how vivid his impressions were. He could almost see those who would have worshipped there. Pallid faces sheltering from the bitter cold of winter, bodies withered by the fruitless produce of a poor harvest, yet fear of something extraordinary and undefined suffocating their every thought. Yes, the church was such a decrepit little place that it was easy for the mind to populate it with the ghosts of lamented souls. Of course, he had no way of knowing how correct or inaccurate his assumptions were. Shirking off the shivers of a wandering mind, and laughing to himself for being so easily affected by the place, John's gaze finally fell upon the inscription carved above, into the back wall. Reaching out, he ran his fingers over the dips and rough edges left by the author's chisel. It was clear that the message on the wall was out of place, rushed as it was with each letter unaligned with those which came before it, suggesting them to be the product of someone hurried, wishing to spend as little time within the church as possible. Standing back, the light from his phone now illuminated the words which came sharply into focus, reading, "Those who dwelt in Dungorth took this hill in 1472. In 1481, we gave it back, in hope that those we disturbed will forgive us for our trespasses." Contemplating the meaning of the inscription, he stood motionless once more, as the fearfully apologetic wording began to gently disturb him. Either the region was one of the struggle, having been previously settled by another clan, or perhaps the original inhabitants of the hill shared a preoccupation with myth and superstition with their modern counterparts in the village below. At first, the noise did not filter entirely into his awareness. It was only when repeated with uneven rhythm that his mind recognized its nature. Still facing the inscription, his back turned toward the church hall, the creeping cold sensation he had experienced outside returned sharply to his arms. His body quivered in retaliation to the temperature, which had nose-dived at an alarming rate, his breath visible in panicked puffs in front of his face. John's flesh crawled once more with fear, as the sound of one foot scuffing a stone floor nearby was slowly followed by another. But who would be in such a place? Not one of the villagers, not with their superstitions and stories of warning and omen about the hillside. The footsteps felt close, and as his confidence diminished, John's thoughts now fled simply to escape. As the noise increased in volume, threatening proximity, it was clear that he would have to rush past whoever stood there to make it to the door. There was nothing left for it. He had to push the jarring fear which now gripped him out of his mind. Slowly, he turned to face whoever was behind him. For a moment, he thought that he would be faced by the strained faces of those from his imagination. But the hall was devoid of life, empty. Yet still, the sound of feet scuffing cold stone, like sandpaper on skin, filled the air. John's frozen gasp rang out as something moved in the corner of his eye. Turning quickly to the darkened doorway which led underneath, the head of an indecipherable figure moved as its body raised up slowly with each shuffling step from below. Terror coursed through his veins to such a degree that his rationality melted away, to be replaced by pure instinct. As he burst into a sprint, jumping off the platform, leaving the altar and inscription behind, he felt a deep and unyielding fear tear at his insides. Stumbling as he landed, the impact dislodged more debris from above as several pieces of large stone smashed into the church floor, one narrowly missing his head by only a few inches. The exit drew ever closer, and fevered thoughts now filled his mind as he scrambled over and through piles of ruined and forgotten sediment, dead skin cast off by the ancient building without remorse. For a moment, he felt surrounded, impressed upon by a man of the cloth, preaching of sin and ancient evil, while a pitiable and diminished congregation huddled together in fear of what walked nearby. As the footsteps scuffed the dirt and dust-ridden floor, John's clarity of mind returned. and as he began to climb up a large pile of broken wood and stone, the door to safety on the other side, his curiosity calmed his nerves momentarily. The dread he felt in his stomach told him to continue onward, out into the open, away from that place. But his need to know was relentless. He had to look. Taking a deep breath, he turned cautiously toward the altar, slowly casting the light from his phone toward the darkened staircase. The air in the hall now grew colder. John's panicked breath visible in the dim light. Darkness seemed to cloud his vision, yet what he could decipher was unmistakable. A tall figure now stood in the doorway, but a deep impression of tortured and perverted humanity emanated from it. Both man and thing exchanged a long and silent stare. Then, a croaking string of syllables emerged from the figure's mouth, a language long forgotten, and while its precise definition eluded John's understanding, the contempt which it spoke of did not. The shape in the doorway now moved forward, and as it intimated its sullen movements, John cried out in terror, haphazardly clinging to the rubble, attempting to reach its summit and then make his way to the door. Now he did not care for silence, his clambering movements echoing throughout the hall, several pieces of stone plunging once more from the roof. As he reached the top of the mound, at the very last moment, he peered above only to see a rock as large as a man hurtling toward him. Jumping for his life, he tumbled down the other side of the debris pile. As his body rolled down toward the floor, a searing pain wrenched through his side. Slamming against the stone ground, the impact surged his bones, leaving him dazed momentarily. Staggering to his feet, he looked down only to recoil in horror. A large chunk of wood had impaled itself several inches into his right side. Blood poured from the wound as he almost instinctively pulled at the piece of wood, it grating his insides before finally being removed. He let out an anguished scream, but as he did so, he turned to a noise from behind. The pain in his side was agony, but the sight he beheld was worse than any sensation. The figure in the door was writhing on its belly, dragging itself at an impossible speed over the rubble and towards him. Its body blackened, the bandaged remnants of a white shroud sliding over the jagged surface with ease. Stumbling in shock, John was paralyzed with fear. Then, the realization took him. Escape was close. Limping badly toward the door, its slight opening now within grasp, he shoved his body through the gap into the light outside. The door pressed and prodded at the wound in his side, sending strikes of pain piercing through his abdomen. With one last push he screamed, the force of his momentum causing him to fall on the ground outside. Looking up through the gap, stared the entombed figure, with its face sneering from inside, its arm outstretched, spitting a vile and deafening groan out into the retreating sunshine. John did not take his time to observe the creature. He staggered once more to his feet, his hand now drenched in blood as it clenched the open wound in his side. Moving as quickly from that place as he could, leaving the church grounds behind, He was sure that he could hear voices from deep inside as he fled. The yells and vitriolic protests of long since gone clergy and congregation, mocking, resentful, and despised. In his haste, he had lost track of his direction, unfamiliar with the surroundings. In the grip of panic, he limped on as fast as he could, but disorientation took him, and before he was aware of how or why, he found himself surrounded by a maze of broken and toppled gravestones. Dizzied and gasping for air, he no longer cared where he was, just as long as he could leave the church and its attendant behind. After catching his breath, he began to negotiate the old cemetery. Some headstones large and looming, while others humble and ruined. Then, as if suffering the effects of an unknown poison, the world began to spin, and as he tried to catch his breath once more, the stones took on an ominous and menacing form, towering above, blocking out the light, staring forcefully down at him. It was not a graveyard which he now stood in, but a ring of warped stones several feet high. They had weathered many storms, ancient and forgotten, long before the first brick had been laid of that adulterated church. Feeling compelled to somehow become closer to one of them, he reached out a hand, touching its moss-covered surface. Flashes of a hidden past now filled his mind, as he felt overcome with faintness. His vision clouded, and the world began to spin as an abrupt nausea swamped his senses, one which was so intense that it knocked him to his knees, and though he struggled valiantly against its grip, within seconds he crumpled to the ground, the wound in his side heaving and throbbing with each beat of his heart. Lying on his back, staring above, the sky seemed to pulse, and everything around became distorted, as though he were detached from the world, viewing it through a thick and warped lens of glass. The light curved inward unnaturally, and the veil of the world drew back, as John gazed into the abyss behind. Awareness left him.